Mr. President, I want to rise about a program that is funded in that conference report. It is a program that we put under the framework of Cuba broadcasting. It is surrogate broadcasting into a closed society, a society for which the state controls all information or attempts to control all information to its 10, 11 million citizens. It is a part of a long tradition of the United States of the Voice of America type of broadcasting, the effort to try to bring a free flow of information into the countries in the world which are governed by despotic rulers. We did this very successfully in the former Soviet Union. We did it very successfully in Eastern Europe. We did it very successfully during the changes of the Czech Republic, then Czechoslovakia, Poland, the Solidarność movement, and many others. We have been proud of that history of bringing the free flow of information. We now try to use it in different parts of the world based on the new challenges we have. And one of those places in the world in which we do this surrogate broadcasting is into the island of Cuba, because it has a repressive regime that will not allow the free flow of information to go to its people. And so we have a program called Radio and Television Martí. Martí is sort of like the George Washington of Cuba, and it is named after him. In 1983, Congress passed the Radio Broadcasting to Cuba Act to provide the people of Cuba through Radio Martí with information the Cuban government would try to censor and keep from them. Subsequently, in 1990, Congress authorized U.S. television broadcasting to Cuba through Radio and Television Martí to support the right of the Cuban people to receive information and ideas they would not normally receive. It opened radio and television broadcasting to Cuba, provided a consistently reliable and authoritative source of accurate, objective, and comprehensive news commentary and other information about events in Cuba and elsewhere. And it did so to promote the cause of freedom inside of Cuba. Now, Mr. President, we know there's a long history of repressive regimes trying to block our surrogate broadcasting around the world. They just don't simply sit back and say, "Yep, send it all in. Let me accept whatever it is that you're sending in." That's not their effort. Their efforts to block, and our difficulty with broadcasting has never been a justification for cutting funding for these programs. We have never submitted to the proposition that when a regime tries to block our surrogate broadcasting, whether it was Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, all of those efforts, there was always blocking taking place. And we never submitted that as a cause for justification for cutting funding for one of these programs. And it shouldn't be a different standard now. I ask, when it comes to Cuba broadcasting, why the double standard? In fact, especially now, especially when change is coming to Cuba, it is in our interest to have the capacity to broadcast information to the Cuban people. I want to show one of the charts that may be a little difficult back at home, but these are actual photographs which came from a January 2009 Government Accountability Office report, which were provided by an organization that reports on Cuban affairs, and it depicted evidence of Cubans' ability to watch Television Martí despite Cuban jamming efforts. These pictures were taken from inside of Cuba. Now, they may not be the best picture quality, although I doubt they have digital television inside of Cuba, but nonetheless, they have the ability to see it. As a matter of fact, there are other pictures of Cubans. Here's a picture. This picture is actually a group of individuals who, in fact, are part of an effort to create a library system. Something as fundamental in the United States as a free public library. Well, there isn't that in Cuba, at least not a free public library. It's controlled what books might be found there. So these groups try to create information, and one of the things that they do is, again, be able to have access. This is a panel that's talking on television, Marti. Here's a young child watching a Marti program inside of Cuba. You can see the logo here of Marti TV. This was a special that was broadcasted into Cuba and was seen in Cuba on the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and the whole issue of peaceful, nonviolent change as a message to the Cuban people that, in fact, these things could be achieved. Now, you can see at the bottom of these pictures, a little hard, but here, this is the Marti logo that is seen on the bottom right-hand corner on several of these photographs, the Marti logo. This came from that Government Accountability Report. The January 2009 report by the Government Accountability Office noted the following: that the Broadcasting Board of Governors, which is the oversight that we have as the federal government, and the Office of Cuba Broadcasting, and the United States Interest Section in Havana, which in essence is comprehensive news commentary and other information about events in Cuba and elsewhere. And it did so to promote the cause of freedom inside of Cuba. Now, Mr. President, we know there's a long history of repressive regimes trying to block our surrogate broadcasting around the world. They just don't simply sit back and say, yep, send it all in, let me accept whatever it is that you're sending in. That's not their effort. Their efforts to block, and our difficulty with broadcasting has never been a justification for cutting funding for these programs. We have never submitted to the proposition that when a regime tries to block our surrogate broadcasting, whether it was Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, all of those efforts, there was always blocking taking place. And we never submitted that as a cause for justification for cutting funding for one of these programs. And it shouldn't be a different standard now. I ask, when it comes to Cuba broadcasting, why the double standard? In fact, especially now, especially when change is coming to Cuba, it is in our interest to have the capacity to broadcast information to the Cuban people. I want to show one of the charts that may be a little difficult back at home, but these are actual photographs which came from a January 2009 Government Accountability Office report, which were provided by an organization that reports on Cuban affairs, and it depicted evidence of Cubans' ability to watch television Marti despite Cuban jamming efforts. These pictures were taken from inside of Cuba. Now, they may not be the best picture quality, although I doubt they have digital television inside of Cuba, but nonetheless, they have the ability to see it. As a matter of fact, there are other pictures of Cubans. Here's a picture. This picture is actually a group of individuals who, in fact, are part of an effort to create a library system, something as fundamental in the United States as a free public library. Well, there isn't that in Cuba, at least not a free public library. It's controlled what books might be found there. So these groups try to create information, and one of the things that they do is, again, be able to have access. This is a panel that's talking on television, Marti. Here's a young child watching a Marti program inside of Cuba. You can see the logo here of Marti TV. This was a special that was broadcasted into Cuba and was seen in Cuba on the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and the whole issue of peaceful, nonviolent change as a message to the Cuban people that, in fact, these things could be achieved. Now, you can see at the bottom of these pictures, a little hard, but here, this is the Marti logo that is seen on the bottom right-hand corner on several of these photographs, the Marti logo, the Marti logo. This came from that Government Accountability Report. The January 2009 report by the Government Accountability Office noted the following: that the Broadcasting Board of Governors, which is the oversight that we have as the federal government, and the Office of Cuba Broadcasting, and the United States Interest Section in Havana, which in essence is, we don't have embassies because we don't have relationships, but we have an interest section there. That Cuban officials emphasize that they face Cuba officials, those people inside from our interest section, emphasize that they face significant challenges in conducting valid audience research due to the closed nature of Cuban society. U.S. government officials stationed in Havana are prohibited by the Castro regime from traveling outside of Havana. We know it's difficult to travel to Cuba for the purpose of conducting audience research. We know the threat of Cuban government surveillance and reprisals for interviewers and respondents raise concerns about respondents' willingness to answer sensitive questions frankly. In this January 2009 Government Accountability Report, U.S. officials indicated that research on radio and TV Marti's audience size faces significant limitations. For example, none of the data is representative of the entire Cuban population. Telephone surveys are the only random data collection effort in Cuba, but it might not be representative of Cuba's media habits for several reasons, but here are two of the main ones. First, only adults in homes with published telephone numbers are surveyed. And according to the Broadcasting Board of Governors documents, approximately 17% of Cuban adults live in households with published telephone numbers. That means that 83% of the population doesn't have a published telephone number. And second, the Board of Governors and the Office of Cuba Broadcasting officials noted that because individuals in Cuba are discouraged or prohibited by their government from listening to and watching U.S. international broadcasts, they might be fearful of responding to media surveys and disclosing their media habits. If I'm told that it is illegal for me simply to watch the programming of some international organization and that I can go to jail for listening to that programming, then ultimately, am I going to be truthful to some telephone survey about did I watch TV Marti? Did I listen to Radio Marti? Mr. President, I know about this personally. Years ago, when I was in the House of Representatives, well, I had an aunt who was still alive at the time, who I had asked never to acknowledge me as her nephew, which she agreed to. In my second term, however, she was listening to me on Radio Marti. And in a moment of pride, she said, "Oh, that Menendez is my nephew." Unfortunately, she said it in front of some visitors who she thought were her friends. And one of them was part of el Comité de la Defensa de la Revolución, which means the Committee to Defend the Revolution, a block watch organization in every city, in every village, in every hamlet inside of Cuba, whose only job is to go and spy on their neighbors and tell the state security who speaks ill or does something against the regime. Unfortunately, for that simple act of speaking out, as saying to a friend, "Oh, that Menendez is my nephew," my aunt suffered serious consequences. So the audience size might very well be larger than the survey results would indicate, because people are fearful to say, "Yes, I'm listening to Radio and Television Marti because I can't do that and not face the consequences of a regime that would arrest me." Radio and TV Marti have a larger audience in Cuba. Why do I say that? Because a 2007 survey that the Office of Cuba Broadcasting Commission intended to obtain information on programming preferences and media habits also contained data on Radio and TV Marti's audience size. while the survey was not intended to measure listening rates or project audience size, this non-random survey of 382 Cubans who had recently arrived in the United States, so now they were free to say what they actually did back at home because they were not subject to being arrested simply for listening to radio or television. Marti found that 45% of all of those respondents reported listening to Radio Marti, and that over 21% reported watching TV Marti within the last 6 months before leaving Cuba. So, Mr. President, I rise because I want to bring this data, this information, this perspective to the debate. Now, I'm happy to see that the very deep cuts that were made to the Office of Cuba Broadcasting that contains both radio and television Marti have largely been restored. And that's one of the reasons that I felt willing to vote to proceed with the Omnibus bill. One of this great body's greatest strengths is the ability to freely debate issues in an open format, issues on which in the end we might completely disagree, but issues that need to be brought into clear focus for the American people. However, when I see my colleagues drawing conclusions on their own without reasonable data to support those conclusions, I feel to come and present an alternative of the facts. Now, why is this important to us? Well, the United States is a beacon of light of freedom and democracy around the world. The promotion of democracy and human rights is has always been one of the pillars of our foreign policy. Yesterday was Human Rights Day, which is the day that marks the anniversary of the United Nations Assembly's adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. It is recognized every year on December 10th. And yesterday, in the midst of the recognition of this day in Havana, we saw the brutal Castro regime cracking down on people just because they are trying to exercise their right for peaceful demonstration. We see people beaten, arrested, and forcibly detained. There's a group of ladies. They call themselves the Ladies in White. They are mothers and sisters and friends of jailed dissidents inside of Cuba. And so these are people who have family members, their son or daughter, their brother or sister, their friends. And the only reason those people are in jail is because they have pursued peaceful means to try to create change inside of their own country. So they may have said something. They may have worn a white band that says cambio, which means change. They may have simply uttered the fact that what we need is change inside of Cuba. And so these ladies in white, they dress fully in white, so that in fact it is a form of being noticed, but again a peaceful form. They held long stem flowers and miniature Cuban flags. They were attacked by hundreds of angry pro-government demonstrators who sought to drown out their chants of freedom by yelling, "This street belongs to Fidel." Now in Cuba, these groups are not spontaneous. It is not the citizenry. It is something called rapid response brigades. They are state security dressed as civilians whose purpose is to make it seem that the populace is against the human rights activists and political dissidents. But ultimately, they are state security agents who act in a way to make it seem quite different. But they're thugs. Mr. President, the reason the regime organizes protests in this way is so that if you orchestrate a protest where it looks like its citizens are protesting against each other, then the regime can deny, in fact, any role in the events. However, Mr. President, we know very well the role the Castro regime plays in these demonstrations, especially in light of the events of yesterday And today, we know the Castro regime is a brutal, totalitarian dictatorship that continues to violate the most basic human rights, continues to crush debate and crush dialogue. Now, yesterday I came to the floor as part of my concerns, and I spoke about this gentleman and his wife. I spoke about Jorge Luis Garcia Perez Antunes. This is a gentleman who spent, simply for standing on a plaza in his hometown, which is in the center of Havana. It's not where the tourists go, Mr. President. It's not on the beaches of Havana. It's in the heart of Havana. And he got up and he said, what we need is the type of change we saw in Eastern Europe. For that simple statement, he was thrown into jail 17 years. 17 years. He came out a couple years ago, but he has not changed. He has not changed his views or his effort to create human rights. And he issued a letter, public letter, that I read yesterday, an English translation of, a public letter that he wrote to the present dictator, Raul Castro, the brother of Fidel Castro. And he said many things. And I'm not going to read the whole letter again, but he said things like, let me ask you a few questions that I think are important. What right do the authorities, without any prior crime being committed, detain and impede the free movement of their citizens in violation of a universally recognized right, the very rights that are being observed in that International Human Rights Day of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? What feelings could move a man like Captain Idel Gonzalez Morfi to beat my wife, a defenseless woman, so brutally, costing lasting effects to her bones, for the sole act of arriving at a radio station to denounce with evidence the torture that her brother, this is his wife, received in a Cuban prison? Now, I spoke about him yesterday and his letter, and what happened today, Mr. President. Today, the day after the Human Rights Day, and the day after I read his letter into the record, and 2 days after he presented that letter to Raul Castro, he was arrested again by the regime and arbitrarily detained with his wife and another activist. What's his crime? That I read a letter in the United States Senate about his calls for freedom and democracy? And the day after the recognition of international human rights, he gets arrested today, and his wife gets arrested today. Or detained today, I'm not sure. He got arrested for sure. TV Marti is one of the many efforts the United States government rightly invests in trying to reach the Cuban people with information, to try to reach the people who were beaten today and yesterday and for decades, simply for trying to demonstrate peacefully, to speak their mind, to walk in peace in remembrance of their loved ones they lost under the clenched fist of this regime. I feel badly that the day after I spoke about Mr. Antunes, he ends up in jail. And so we need to have a spotlight, Mr. President, just like we did for Alexander Solzhenitsyn and Soviet Jewry, just like we did for Václav Havel as he was trying to create change towards the Czech Republic, just like we did with Lech Walesa when he was having the Solidarność movement inside of Poland. For some reason, I can't get anybody to come to this floor and talk about the human rights violations inside of Cuba. I hear a lot about let's trade with Cuba, let's do business with Cuba, let's travel to Cuba. But God, I never hear anyone talking about these human rights activists, which are the Lech Walesas, the Václav Havels, the Alexander Solzhenitsyns of that other time. This man got arrested today simply because yesterday we made his letter public. That is the Castro regime that I know, not the romanticism that some people have about what goes on that island. And so I'm pleased that the Office of Cuba Broadcasting has made efforts over the last year to reevaluate the programs they're carrying out and carefully consider creative ways to reach the Cuban people. They've done this with Television Marti. They'll continue to do this with other programs. I would expect nothing less. The kind of evaluation should continue. We should constantly strive to tailor our programs so that our investments are reaching those who truly need our help. Investments that are advancing U.S. foreign policy interests, the national interests of the United States, and the national security interests of the United States. And finally, Mr. President, I want to ask the unanimous consent to include into the record a declaration that came out of Cuba of over 100 human rights activists inside of Cuba who are in support of the efforts of the United States as it relates to the surrogate broadcasting that goes into Cuba from Radio and Television Marti, so that, in fact, there can be some free flow of information of what is happening in the rest of the world and what is happening inside of Cuba, because that's part of what we help here, to let those who otherwise would not know because of a closed society and a dictatorship that rules with an iron fist what's happening even inside of their own country. What's happening to people like Mr. Antunes? What's happening to the ladies in white who are protesting peacefully about their loved ones in jail?
Without objection, so ordered.
And with that letter of over 100 human rights activists, with the recognition that we will not let up until Mr. Antunes is freed, and with the recognition that there are voices who will continue to speak out for the human rights. Because the last point, Mr. President, I want to make, imagine if you were sitting in a gulag somewhere, if you were beaten simply because you had a few words to say about creating change peacefully in your own country. Imagine if you could be swept away by state security police and taken to some jail and maybe not seen for years after that. Would you not want someone, somewhere in the world, to be standing up and speaking for you? I would, and that's what I try to do on this floor. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.